That's for Sanjay.
The Drifter is an evolution of the point-and-click adventure, delivering a highly refined experience. Unfortunately, it might be a bittersweet symphony, but I'll explain that later. The Drifter immediately hooks you in with its captivating sci-fi thriller narrative that features one of the strongest opening 10 minutes that I've ever played. It also features superb voice acting, a flawless gamepad experience, and challenging puzzles that avoid genre tropes of being obtuse. With almost perfect pacing through 10-hour-long chapters, The Drifter felt less like a point-and-click and more like a binge-worthy season on Netflix that left me wanting a second season. Before jumping in, we just want to take a few seconds out of your day. If at the end of the video you enjoyed it, subscribe and see more like it. Video games is a positivity-first outlet, so let's start with the positives about this game. If you do a quick search for the best point-and-click adventure games, you'll see that over 95% of them were released in the mid to early 90s, which is because the genre failed to adapt and evolve with the changing industry. Point-and-click adventures felt hamstrung by how they found success in the first place, with far-fetched narratives and obtuse puzzles. The Drifter pays tribute to the pinnacle of the genre, and even though it features a retro pixel art aesthetic, everything about it feels elevated. In The Drifter, you play as Mick Carter, a homeless man who drifts from one place to the next after a traumatic experience in his life leaves him running from the pain. With the recent death of his mother, Mick must make a quick stop at his hometown for the funeral. At the core of The Drifter, there are ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances, and no matter how far-fetched some of the plot can get at times, it always felt grounded due to the intimacy of the writing. Typically, I don't mind setting up the narrative for games by explaining what happens in the early portions, as that can help provide background for the experience. But The Drifter begins like a bullet from a gun. Within minutes, Mick is caught in the middle of a conspiracy, including time travel, government testing, and serial killers. The impact of the first chapter can't be understated, as it establishes such a strong tone with great hooks that the game will follow for the remainder of the experience. Once the story is set up, you will need to figure out what's happening and get to the bottom of it, but your first order of duty is finding a way to charge your phone, which can be problematic for a Drifter. Most point-and-click adventure games hang their hat on the puzzles within, and The Drifter offered a great selection that constantly rewarded common sense thinking. Early in the game, you need to find a hose to fix a car with a bad fuel pump, and what seemed logical was the washing machine that had been dumped at the homeless site. Once I found a knife to pry open the panel, there was a hose, and all that was left to do was cut it out and attach it to the vehicle. The puzzles were still challenging, and even when I would get stumped, the solution always made sense. At around 10 hours, The Drifter is on the long end of the spectrum within the genre. However, The Drifter is broken into 10 chapters that take about an hour each, or roughly the length of an episode of your favorite show. In conjunction with this, they always ended on a cliffhanger or right after a big reveal where you wanted to know what happens next. Due to all of this, The Drifter felt as much like a refined point-and-click adventure as it did a binge-worthy show on Netflix. Powerhoof is only 2 people, and while they might be working within their limits with the visuals, there are a lot of stylistic choices made throughout that show true artistry. For example, many of the scenes don't take up the full screen and instead highlight and give the scene weight. The visuals of being trapped in a coffin, or even the very first scene of the game where you're a stowaway on a train car, are much more impactful than they would be if they were just in the middle of a screen full of visuals. Although The Drifter sidesteps a lot of the common issues with point and clicks, there are still a few minor issues that do slightly hinder the experience. As mentioned, controls are optimized for a gamepad, which leads to the freedom to walk around, but unfortunately, Mick can get stuck in the environment. Sadly, you can't just walk your way out using the thumbsticks. You will need to open up the radial action menu and select something to get him out. Although the first chapter sets a very high bar, which it was surprisingly able to maintain for the majority of the experience, there was a singular chapter near the end that lingered on a little longer than the rest and interrupted a flawless pacing that the Drifter had. The Drifter also lacked consistency at times. For starters, the game establishes a certain logic of how the universe works, but at times breaks the logic itself. Despite the extraordinary plot, the Drifter stays relatively grounded in realism, but once again it gets broken at times when Mick is able to carry almost anything on him. The other immersion issue is when you had to suspend belief was when you would leave a certain scene, only to return much later and the character you left was exactly where they were. The Drifter intertwines time travel, trauma, and conspiracies. The voice acting across the board is superb. The puzzles are challenging but never obtuse, and it avoids the common pitfalls of the genre. The biggest problem with The Drifter is its release year, because it might be a bittersweet symphony, as it's one of the best point-and-click games in years and possibly even decades. Unfortunately, sometime during the mid to late 90s, the majority of the audience moved on, and the genre has become relatively niche. The Drifter is a must for fans of the golden era of the point-and-click genre, but thanks to its refinement, it's also for anyone who loves a good sci-fi thriller adventure. Let me know in the comments below what you think is the best point-and-click adventure game of all time. That's all for today, but until next time, be good to your fellow gamer, but more importantly, be better to your fellow human.